Financial crises are not accidents. They are the predictable, if not always predicted, culmination of human behavior, of greed, optimism, leverage, and the collective suspension of disbelief that economists call irrational exuberance. Across 4 centuries of modern financial history, the same forces have assembled themselves with remarkable consistency. A new asset or technology ignites genuine excitement. Easy credit floods the market, prices detach from underlying value, latecomers pile in, terrified of missing out, and then inevitably, the structure collapses under its own weight. What follows is not merely a financial event, but a social one, a reckoning that reshapes institutions, redistributes wealth, and plants the seeds, almost always, of the next great crisis. Let's trace that arc from its earliest recognizable predecessors in 17th century Holland and 18th century Britain through the defining American crises of 1837, 1873, 1907, 1929, 1987, 2000, and 2008. The goal is not simply to chronicle disaster, but to illuminate the connective tissue between these events, the ways in which each crisis borrowed language, structure, and fatal habits from the ones that came before, and how each, in resolving itself, laid groundwork for the catastrophe that followed. To understand the financial crises of the United States, one must begin in Holland in the 1630s, where the world witnessed what is widely considered the first recorded speculative bubble. The Dutch Republic was at the height of its golden age, a prosperous mercantile society with sophisticated financial instruments, a thriving middle class, and an advanced system of commodity trading. Into this fertile environment came the tulip, a flower imported from the Ottoman Empire and prized for its vivid variegated blooms. By the early 1630s, certain rare varieties of tulip bulbs, particularly those infected with a mosaic virus that produced striking streaked petals, had become status symbols among the Dutch elite. Demand pushed prices upward, and as prices rose, speculation followed. What made Dutch tulip mania historically significant was not merely that prices rose, but the financial innovation that accompanied the speculation. Traders began buying and selling futures contracts on tulip bulbs, agreements to purchase bulbs at a set price at a future date, meaning that participants could speculate on tulips they had never seen and would never physically handle. By the peak of the mania in late 1636 and early 1637, a single Semper Augustus bulb reportedly traded for the equivalent of a fine Amsterdam canal house. The market had become entirely disconnected from the intrinsic or even decorative value of the flower. When prices collapsed in February 1637, they did so almost instantaneously. Buyers refused to honor contracts, courts declined to enforce them as gambling debts, and fortunes evaporated overnight. The crash illustrated, for the first time in documented history, the central dynamic of all speculative bubbles. The belief that an asset's price will rise indefinitely is always and everywhere a form of collective fiction, and fictions eventually end. 80 years later and across the North Sea, the British South Sea Company bubble of 1720 replicated and amplified the lessons of tulip mania on an institutional scale. The South Sea Company was incorporated in 1711 with a monopoly on British trade with Spanish South America, a trade that scarcely existed in reality, given that Spain controlled those ports and was frequently at war with Britain. But the promise of vast commercial riches, combined with a scheme to convert a portion of the British national debt into company shares, made South Sea stock enormously attractive to investors hungry for yield in a low-interest environment. Crucially, the company cultivated connections with members of Parliament and the royal court, and it used bribes and the promise of stock allocations to ensure political protection. Share prices rose from roughly £100 in January 1720 to over £1,000 by August of the same year, a tenfold increase driven entirely by speculation. The company encouraged investors to buy on installment, paying a small deposit on shares with the remainder due later, creating an early and recognizable form of leveraged investment. When the bubble burst in September 1720, it took with it the savings of thousands of investors across Britain and continental Europe, from aristocrats to small tradespeople who had mortgaged their futures on paper promises. The crash prompted Parliament to pass the Bubble Act, restricting the formation of joint stock companies, an early example of post-crisis regulation that, ironically, would later be blamed for inhibiting the legitimate commercial expansion that might have prevented subsequent crises. Together, tulip mania and the South Sea bubble established the essential template. Both involved a genuine underlying asset or commercial idea that was distorted beyond recognition by speculative excess. Both were accelerated by financial innovation, futures contracts in Holland, installment buying and debt conversion in Britain, that allowed participants to take on more risk than they could sustain. Both were animated by a narrative of boundless future wealth that made skepticism seem foolish in the short term, and both collapsed abruptly, destroying real wealth and real livelihoods. These themes would echo with only superficial variation through every major financial crisis that followed. The first great financial crisis of the American Republic unfolded against the backdrop of explosive westward expansion and a banking system that was, by any measure, chronically underdisciplined. The young United States had emerged from the War of 1812 with an appetite for growth that outpaced its institutional infrastructure. Land sales in the Western territories were booming, cotton prices were high, and a proliferating network of state-chartered banks was issuing paper currency backed by increasingly dubious reserves. The Second Bank of the United States, chartered in 1816, had provided some measure of central regulatory discipline, but by the early 1830s it had become the target of President Andrew Jackson, who viewed it as a corrupt instrument of Eastern financial elites and foreign creditors. Jackson's decision not to renew the bank's charter in 1832 and his subsequent order to remove federal deposits from it and distribute them among favored state banks, the so-called pet banks, removed the principal check on the expansion of credit. State banks, flush with federal deposits and operating under minimal oversight, dramatically increased their lending, much of it collateralized by land, whose value was itself rising on speculative sentiment. Between 1832 and 1836, the number of state-chartered banks nearly doubled, the volume of banknotes in circulation exploded, and land sales on the frontier soared to extraordinary levels. Speculators purchased vast tracts of federal land with paper currency that was, in many cases, backed by little more than confidence. The crisis was triggered by a combination of tightening credit from Britain, which had been financing much of the American expansion, and Jackson's Specie Circular of 1836, an executive order requiring that federal land purchases be made in gold or silver rather than paper currency. This single policy change exposed the fundamental fragility of a credit system built on paper promises. Land values fell as demand collapsed. Banks that had extended credit against inflated land prices found their collateral worthless. And a wave of bank failures swept the country in 1837. Hundreds of banks suspended specie payments. The economy contracted sharply, unemployment rose, and the depression that followed lasted in varying degrees until the early 1840s. The Panic of 1837 introduced several themes that would recur persistently in American financial history. The first was the role of easy credit, expanded rapidly in a period of optimism as the engine of both boom and subsequent bust. The second was the political dimension of financial regulation, the way that deregulatory impulses, often framed in the populist language of freeing ordinary citizens from elite financial control, could create the very conditions for mass financial ruin. The third was the international contagion dynamic. The Panic of 1837 was not purely domestic, but was substantially worsened by Britain's decision, under pressure from the Bank of England, to tighten credit and reduce exposure to American debt. A reminder that in an integrated financial world, crises respect no borders. If the Panic of 1837 was a crisis of land and easy money, the Panic of 1873 was a crisis of infrastructure and overinvestment, a distinction that, upon inspection, dissolves into the same underlying pathology. The decades following the Civil War were a period of extraordinary American economic ambition. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, had opened the continent to commerce and fired the imagination of investors and speculators alike. Railroad construction became the defining investment of the era, absorbing vast quantities of capital from domestic and European investors who believed, with some justification, that the railroads represented the future of the American economy. The problem was that railroad construction had far outpaced the economic activity required to service the debt that financed it. Investment banks, most prominently J. Cook and Company, had underwritten massive bond issuances for railroads, whose revenue projections were built on optimistic assumptions about traffic volumes and freight revenues that reality would not support. The federal government had subsidized railroad construction with land grants and bond guarantees, creating moral hazard, the implicit assurance that public money would backstop private risk-taking. When J. Cook and Company, then the most powerful investment bank in the United States, failed to sell the bonds of the Northern Pacific Railroad and was forced to close its doors in September 1873, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The New York Stock Exchange closed for 10 days, an unprecedented measure. Banks across the country failed. Railroad companies defaulted on their bonds in waves. The depression that followed, known at the time as the Great Depression, before that term was reassigned to the cataclysm of the 1930s, lasted roughly 6 years in the United States and was even longer and deeper in Europe, where it was known simply as the Long Depression. Unemployment soared, wages fell, and labor unrest, including the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the largest labor uprising in American history to that point, reflected the social weight of sustained economic contraction. The Panic of 1873 added new dimensions to the American crisis template. It demonstrated the particular danger of leveraged overinvestment in a single transformative technology, a danger that would resurface in the railroad-era crises of the 1890s, in the dot-com bubble of the 1990s, and in the housing-backed securities complex of the 2000s. It also highlighted the role of investment banks as both architects and amplifiers of systemic risk, institutions that in their pursuit of underwriting fees could load the financial system with liabilities whose underlying risks were poorly understood or deliberately obscured, and it showed with painful clarity that post-crisis recovery is measured not in months but in years, and that the social consequences of financial collapse, unemployment, labor conflict, political radicalization, extend far beyond the balance sheets of banks and investors. The Panic of 1907 arrived in October, triggered by the collapse of a scheme to corner the copper market by speculators connected to the Knickerbocker Trust Company of New York. When the scheme failed and Knickerbocker's losses became known, depositors began queuing to withdraw their funds. Trust companies, which occupied a regulatory gray zone, enjoying many of the privileges of banks with fewer of the requirements, were particularly vulnerable. As the run on Knickerbocker spread to other trust companies and thence to the broader banking system, the stock market collapsed, credit froze, and the country faced the prospect of a systemic financial meltdown. What saved the system in 1907 was not a government institution, but a single private citizen, J.P. Morgan, the dominant figure in American finance, who at the age of 70 convened the country's leading bankers in his Madison Avenue library and, through a combination of personal authority, financial genius, and ruthless coordination, organized a series of private rescue packages. Morgan directed capital to failing institutions, strong-armed solvent banks into providing liquidity, and personally guaranteed the stability of the New York Stock Exchange. His intervention worked, but only barely, and the episode exposed with unmistakable clarity the absurdity of relying on the goodwill and ability of a single private individual to prevent national financial catastrophe.